Um, so we just wanted to give everyone uh, more of an idea about the state budget. I can almost hear some of the like eye rolls and sighs that probably come from starting to talk about a state budget. Um, but it is really important and it's really key to the work that we do. So, we think it's really important to get out there and do public education around it. So my apologies if you already know some or all of this, but hopefully some of it will be useful to you. So let's start out with what is the state budget? Not going to give you some dictionary definition of it, but we're going to sort of present it from what we know at MassBudget about state budget documents. So first thing is, it is actually the largest piece of legislation passed each year by the state. It's a, $60 billion policy tool. It's a very long document. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's not light reading. Another thing that it is actually a set of inputs and outputs. So money comes in, money goes out. And, I want to draw your attention to the left side of the slide here. Our state budget actually includes money from, yes, state tax collections, no surprise, but also fines, fees, gambling revenue, and federal funding. The state actually acts as a conduit for a lot of federal funding. You probably think a lot about COVID-related funding, like the CARES Act. Some of that gets funneled through the state government to beneficiaries. Another thing that it is how a community brings together resources to accomplish things together. I've actually been thinking about taking this last piece off of it, just really focusing on the things that we can do together. Because there are some things that, we can't achieve on our own that we can do collectively. That's a lot of it, but I just feel like the first part of a stronger statement. At any rate, we're bringing together resources to accomplish collective goals, right? And as you know, programs need funding. And if they don't have funding, they don't work. So it's pretty critical. And I can't stress this next point enough. The budget is a statement of values. Every line item in the budget is a choice that someone somewhere made about who gets what and why, right? Isn't that the old definition of politics? Who gets what and why? Well, it's in the state budget, right? Do we fund more affordable housing or more schools? Do we fund both, right? These are open questions. And I think that it's important for us to remember that this is not a foregone conclusion. There's a process that humans go through to create this document. And I think it's useful to remember that, because if we're trying to change what's in the state budget, we need to remember that it is a human-made process and there are people we can go to advocate. The last point I'll make about that is we feel like it's a moral document. This is something that I think is really important to us at MassBudget to remember. So it's not just in the realm of accountants, right? This is something that really matters to people. Oh, sorry. So before we dive in, I just want to go over a few key terms. So first of all, you can broadly break down budgets into the operating budget and the capital budget. Capital budget is like buses, school buildings, that kind of thing. Operating budget is, keeping the lights on, paying salaries, etc. We're going to focus on the operating budget. The capital budget is its own animal that would probably do well with its own presentation. So some more key terms. To appropriate means that the legislature has authorized the money for whatever use they stipulate in the line item. Fiscal year is the calendar that the Massachusetts budget runs on. We are, going from July 1st to June 30th. That's the fiscal year. It gets really confusing when you're doing tax year versus calendar year versus fiscal year. So just be aware. And then the federal fiscal year is a little different. So pretty difficult to keep track of. I get that. Also, there are two really key committees in the legislature: House Ways and Means and Senate Ways and Means. And the Ways and Means committees are those that consider all bills having to do with money, including the budget. Really critical to remember that. They're actually, you could say, a point of a leverage point for advocacy. So how is the state budget created? We know that this thing exists. It's huge. There's a lot there. It's really important. How does this thing get created? Well, there are a number of really key players here. Obviously, the governor is one. The governor's budget proposal is actually the first proposal in the process. So it's kind of getting the foot in the door. You also have the two legislative chambers, the House and the Senate. The leadership there are really important. So you have the House Speaker, and the Senate President. You have the chairs of the Ways and Means Committees. Again, those Ways and Means Committees are really important for money-related bills, including the budget. So the chair of those committees, the chairs of those committees can be quite important in the process. So this is a very long process. If you've ever tracked it, it goes from, sometime in January to July and beyond, because we're rarely on time with our budget these days. So it's a long, really complicated process, and this is just a stylized model of what it looks like. So you start in December, where we actually have to agree on what we think the revenue will be. So under the Massachusetts Constitution, you can't spend more than you have. And so we have to agree on what we think we will have for the next year. That is a process, and it's kind of interesting to, it's called the consensus revenue estimate. It's kind of interesting to sort of pay attention to that and understand, how do they actually come up with these numbers? It turns out that they're often off the mark. It's pretty difficult to predict. You then in January get the governor's budget. So this year that it's actually late because this is a new governor. Once the governor pushes their budget over to the legislature, both chambers actually get to come up with their own proposals, and they can be similar to or even quite different from the governor's proposal. We now have a problem, though, because each chamber has its own competing proposal, right? And they can be quite different because it's two groups of people who have different opinions. And so you get this thing called the conference committee. The conference committee is actually where the differences between the two versions, the House version and the Senate version, are worked through, where the two chambers come to compromise. So one of the things that's interesting about Massachusetts, it's not the only state, but it's a state that allows, so, the governor can veto a piece of legislation, that from, history, politics class, but Massachusetts allows for line item vetoes. That means that the governor can go in and say, I don't like that one line item in the budget. I'm going to strike that. And the legislature can, for all vetoes, the legislature can either override them. So they say basically, we hear you, but we're not going to agree with you. We're going to keep our own thing. Or it can allow the veto to be carried and they just accept the change that the governor suggested. After all of this huge, long process with many actors, you get the final budget. The final budget has the force of law. It is a piece of legislation, and it is actually what authorizes the executive branch to spend the money. The executive branch can't legally spend money unless it's authorized to by the legislature. So we've got this really long process. I'm just going to go through these really quickly. I kind of forgot these were in here. I apologize. Amendments happen in both the House and the Senate budget versions. Again, we have compromise here, the conference committee, and then it's actually a 2/3 majority to override a veto. This is I feel like an important slide. They're leverage points for where you or your constituencies, whoever you are related to, serve, or care about, they're leverage points for you to have a say in the process, right? So you can always talk to the governor's office. Remember, the governor is involved in 2 points, at least. The governor puts forth their proposal, but the governor also gets to veto or sign the legislation at the end of the process. So you can always talk to the governor's office and try to lobby them to support your issue. You, of course, can always talk to your legislative champions, your particular legislator. You could attend public hearings. You could even try to file a bill. That ship has sailed for this session, but you can do that. Something that I'm not going to talk about a lot in this presentation is there's a thing called participatory budgeting that I really recommend you looking into. Most of that has been done at the municipal level. We at MassBudget are trying to think through how that might work at the state level. So maybe stay tuned for that. But these are the leverage points that you have right now. So you'll have these materials, but I feel like this is a really important slide to go back to. So we have this question of, hey, this is a really big document. There's a lot in here. What's actually in the budget? Well, you can go to the budget website and try to figure it out, by downloading their Excel files and trying to put it all together. But one tool that we can offer you at MassBudget is called the budget browser. So it actually goes back to 2001, and it tells you by line item how much is in each budget. So one of the cool things you can do with it is you can look back to 2001 and say, how much of the state budget has gone to education or healthcare, or for a particular line item that your agency or you're interested in. You can go all the way back to 2001 and see what the history of that line item or that category is. Another cool thing about the budget browser is that it actually has an option for you to be able to adjust for inflation, which is really important when you're looking at budget numbers, right? You want to know if the increase or decrease is, how big it is when accounting for inflation. So it's really cool. I hope you'll check it out. And I've got the QR code here, but again, you'll have these materials later. So we have this budget, and we talked about revenue to be able to spend for the budget. So how do we actually pay for all this? Like, where does that money come from? Well, we have to talk a little bit about taxes. And again, our state constitution says that we must balance our budget. We can't spend more than we have. That's the rule here in Massachusetts. This is different from the federal government because the federal government is allowed by law to spend on borrowed money. And because of this balanced budget requirement, we really need to, again, know what we think we're going to have for revenue for next year's budget. So that's why we have that revenue estimate. A lot of our revenue comes from taxes. That's not really surprising, is it? But look at over here, we have federal revenue. That's about a quarter of the state's revenue. That's a lot, right? It's really important to keep track of what's going on at the federal level. How much money is Massachusetts getting from federal programs? Because it affects about 25% of our revenue on average. Another set is fines and fees, right? That's 11%. Those fines and fees tend to be more regressive. They tend to fall harder on communities of color, poorer communities. And so, it's kind of an important thing to know that 11% of our revenue comes from a fairly regressive way of getting revenue. But I want to focus for a minute more on taxes because it is 58% of our revenue. What does our tax system actually look like? There's a lot of talk out there about does the state have too much money? Is the tax rate too high? Blah, 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 blah. When we start talking about taxes, it gets very heated pretty quickly. But what percentage of all the personal income generated in Massachusetts actually goes to state and local taxes? Probably smaller than you think. Turns out it's only about 10.1%. Out of all the income in Massachusetts, all of it that we have, only about 10% goes to state and local taxes. Massachusetts taxes are actually average across the nation. The old moniker of Taxachusetts doesn't really apply anymore because Massachusetts has been cutting taxes since the 1970s. You can see here that Massachusetts has not only been cutting taxes, but it's actually been cutting taxes a lot. This is important because that means we have less revenue, right? And not to state too much of the obvious, but if we have to balance our budget and we have less revenue, well, we can't fund the things that people need. These decades-old tax cuts today cost us billions of dollars a year in revenue. And these cuts affect essential services. You know from the news and your own lives and experiences that there are a lot of unmet needs in our Commonwealth. Childcare is very expensive. Housing is very expensive. There are plenty of people that don't have enough food to eat. By cutting taxes, we're limiting the state's ability to address these needs. So we at MassBudget think that's really important to pay attention to. Let's talk about who pays taxes. Actually, in the chat, if you don't mind, could you tell me, so we have here, what percentage of personal income was paid in taxes, state and local taxes, in 2018? From the top 1%, the middle 60%, and the bottom 20%. So the top 1% is like, you're really, really rich in Massachusetts. The bottom 20% is, economically speaking, you're not doing too well, right? So tell me what you think the bottom 20% pays. For instance, do you think they pay 10% of their income in taxes, 20% of their income in taxes, whatever? You can just drop it in the chat. Okay, I've got one. That's bottom is 0. Anybody else? There's no wrong answer. We're just state and local. So all state and local taxes. Okay, we've got another 0. We've got a 5%. A 10, 2, 10. Okay. All right, let's look at the answer. Oops, sorry. I messed up on that. About 10%. So we had a few people who were right on the nose. So hats off to you. What does this graph tell you, though? This graph tells you that, on average, people at the lower end of the income spectrum pay more as a percentage of their income in taxes than the rich. So the poorer you are in Massachusetts, the more you pay in taxes as a percentage of your income.
I'm leaving. This is depressing.
Myra said she's leaving. This is depressing.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
That's where I'm gonna go pay for the train to take another train.
Yeah, right. She's gonna go pay a transit fee to go home.
Yeah.
So, all right. Yep. Bye. So this might not be surprising to most or all of you. In some audiences that we do this presentation for, it's quite surprising. And we at MassBudget feel like this is unacceptable. So actually, I'm just checking the chat again, just a little quick. Local tax, yeah, local tax mostly means property tax. I mean, there's some there's some local option taxes around like hotels and rental cars and cannabis and yada, yada, yada. But, I think if I'm not mistaken, I think the bulk of the local tax is still property tax. So anyway, that is who pays Massachusetts taxes. Now, let's talk about income inequality. You can see here that over time since 1980, the top 1% of earners have really increased their share of total income. I.e., income inequality is a lot higher than it was in 1980 in Massachusetts. One of the reasons for this, it's not the only one, but one of the reasons for this is the way that we do taxation, right? If this is the distribution of the tax burden, this is not so surprising, right? Let's talk real quickly about regressive and progressive taxes. So the distribution that I showed you of state and local taxes, that is regressive, right? For folks who are poor, pay more as a percentage of their income, that's regressive. In progressive taxes, the opposite is true. So the more you have, the more as a percentage of your income that you pay in taxes. So, for instance, some states, not Massachusetts, but some states have a quote unquote progressive income tax, which means that the rates go up as you go up in income, right? So maybe, the bottom rate is 5%, and if you're really, really rich, it's 8% or something like that. There's plenty of work in public finance to sort of go to if you're interested in all this, but basically things like fees, fines, fares, those are regressive because they tend to hit people at the lower income end of the income spectrum more. Sales taxes, gas taxes are also more on the regressive side. Same for property taxes, actually. One of the things that's interesting in Massachusetts is Chapter 70. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but Chapter 70 helps to equalize some of the education spending across towns, right? Because some towns can afford to spend more on education. That actually is one of the, by using state money, right? You're not relying only on local property taxes, right? So that kind of helps a little bit in sharing the burden of paying for education.
Actually, Jason, can I interrupt really quickly to see if folks have any questions? I know I've seen a couple in the chat. I don't know if they've been addressed or not, but I just wanted to make sure that while while the questions are pertinent, I want to make sure that that people get to ask them if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I see. Let's see. Christine had a question. Does local tax mean property tax? And then I think, let's see.
Yeah, I think I spoke to that
Okay.
one, but let me know, Christine, if that's.
All right. So, okay. All right. Sorry about that. I just wanted to make sure everybody was able to ask while the iron was hot. So, okay. Well, all right. Sorry about that. Thanks, Jason.
No, that's okay. I mean, I'm happy for folks to ask a question. I mean, raising a hand is probably, I can't see everybody. So, raising a virtual hand is helpful, or dropping them in the chat as you have been. So, one of the things that we just did, and, MassBudget is very excited about this, is that we passed the Fair Share Amendment. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a 4% surtax on incomes over, adjusted gross incomes over $1 million. So that actually helps to make our income tax system more progressive, right? Because folks with more money, and in terms of the Massachusetts income distribution, $1 million is a lot of money. There are comparatively pretty few people making much above that. But one of the things that is kind of interesting, and I don't know how much you've talked about this, getting a policy win, like getting the constitutional amendment, which is fair share, is only part of the battle if you're trying to change policy. Another huge piece of the puzzle is implementation, right? So right now for fair share, because I mean, that's, in our view, one of the biggest tax developments recently. So I'm going to focus on that for a minute. But, the voters approved fair share. Well, how do you implement that, right? It is a constitutional amendment, right? So that part of it is, it's in the Constitution. But how do you actually, how does a DOR, the Department of Revenue, make regulations to govern, how the income's collected, how you claim it on a form, right? All of those things. So it's actually going to be interesting this legislative session to see how the legislature handles that, right? What do they do? What kind of laws do they pass? What kind of budget language do they have to protect, the fair share money is supposed to be for education and transportation. What does the legislature do in terms of budget language and legislation to enact that? And also, how does DOR track that on a form? And, how is the data made available for us to track? This is just a really important point that we really need to pay attention to the implementation of any of these changes. So that's actually sort of the general presentation that we give. I was hoping for just sort of talking through some of the things that are interesting to you all. I know that, I was really happy to see, this breadth of experience, and, varied backgrounds. And I can imagine that, some of you are interested in education, some of you are interested in, climate change policy. I mean, I'm sure it runs the gamut. And I'm kind of wondering, are there, what ways, when you see this presentation, what do you think of for what you're interested in? What kind of burning questions do you have? Or do you have questions about what was just presented? I was sort of hoping that maybe there'd be more of a conversation and less me just yapping at you.
No, great. That was very, very thorough and very concise, Jace. Thanks so much for this. Do folks have questions? Because I mean, it is a long process. It can be a very complicated process. It can be in terms of, for folks who have budget items and either livelihoods or their very life and survival hanging in the balance. It can be a very emotional and stressful process. So do folks have any questions on Jason's presentation? Do we want to stop the screen share so people can ask questions, or
yeah, I also definitely want to recognize that I just threw a lot of information at you. So it's okay if you're kind of like, it's 6:24 p.m. Why are you talking to me right now? But it looks like we have some hands raised.
We had, I think Jessica put her hand up first, and Haywan was next. So, Jessica, if you'd like to go ahead with your question.
Yeah, hi Jason. So nice to meet you. Thanks so much for the information presentation.
Sure.
I am familiar a little bit with this information. I've kind of heard of it, but there's some things that you mentioned that I'd love from you to hear about. You mentioned the House Ways and Senate Ways. So I'm just wondering, so that's a new group that I haven't heard of in regards to like if they are making such informative and impactful decisions, where is the transparency in regards to their meetings and their information? Because I just feel like, we talk a lot about transparency and you're talking about data and things of that sort, but this is unfamiliar for me, and I'm not sure if other people aren't familiar. So if anybody else, but so if you could talk about that. I also am interested in you talking about how individuals like ourselves could file bills. I feel like there's a lot of politics in regards to getting people on board, getting people to care. So I'm just wondering if as citizens in our own spaces and like abilities, if we did want to move forward with the bill, how would we do that? And then you also reiterated multiple times, and I quoted, childcare is expensive. And as a data analyst and somebody who I actually advocate for early education often, I hear that a lot from professionals like yourselves. So rather than continue to deficit language in regards to costs, like how are we looking at it at a strength base moving forward, knowing that there's always going to be a cost for care? Thank you, Jason.
Absolutely. Wow, those are really great questions.
I apologize. That was like multiple questions. So if you don't answer one, it's fine.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely want to get to them. Just remind me if I, trail off and forget something. People in my life frequently have to do that for me. I was like, you've been talking for a little bit, Jason, like give it a rest. I just get excited about these things. So yeah, the transparency is a real issue. You have, I'm sure you've seen in the news that, folks in the legislature are not as interested in having committee votes posted and publicly available as maybe they should be.
So where does laws and things in regards to public meetings and like where does that come in regards to legislation and people who are governing money and things that also like where does laws impact legislators is maybe a follow-up question.
Well, I guess the central question here is how do you make people who make the laws make a law that govern themselves, right? That's kind of hard. And, you do have the courts, right? So the courts could come in and say, something that they have done is unconstitutional or against precedent, I guess. And yeah, it's difficult, right? I mean, you have limited leverage over people who over governing the people who make the laws in certain circumstances. I think this is one of them. And, we can advocate, we can use sort of moral leverage, right? Like the transparency should just be a no-brainer, right? But we can try to get out there in the media and advocate and say, this is kind of shameful that there's no light shed on this part of the legislative process. I'm starting to walk outside of my depth by continuing on with this, but I think it is a very difficult question. Certainly, Jason, as an analyst, feel like there should be a lot more transparency. And I think that, one of the things that I think is difficult about the budget is, and I think about this a lot, the budget has been, the narrative around budgeting has become so technocratic, i.e. just only the purview of people who are like economists and CPAs and things like that, that it almost has like removed it from the democratic process, right? I think that's really problematic. And I think at MassBudget, we really want people to start thinking again about, the budget is not just for economists and CPAs, right? This is something we should be paying attention to. It's something that should be accessible, right? We have to ask folks in the legislature for certain documents, certain spreadsheets. Legislators go to the budget browser sometimes because they don't get the data. That's a problem. And so I think, we at MassBudget would definitely support a lot more transparency in the process and making information more available. That's the whole reason for the budget browser, is to just, at the margins, make it a little bit easier for the average person to go in and say, well, what are we doing with the budget? That was long-winded, I apologize. And, the point about childcare is a really great point. I appreciate you bringing that up. I think that this is a specific case of a general phenomenon, which is that we tend to speak in terms of scarcity, right? We talk about public resources as scarce. We talk about, we don't have enough money for this. We don't have, the taxes are too high, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't really talk about the other piece, which is like, if you don't have quality childcare, you don't have a robust workforce. If you don't have good childcare, like there are real costs to not having this. And you should just care about the people. But if you don't, you should listen to the argument that it's also costing us money to not do this. So I think getting away from the narrative and the mindset of scarcity is important when we think about the budget and what we do in policy. And I'm sorry, what was the second point?
How we could create bills. How citizens can create bills.
Oh, right. So that's already passed for this term, unfortunately. It's a pretty quick turnaround at the beginning of the session, and it's like this flurry. The other thing is like thousands of bills get filed, very, very few actually get considered. So I think this is me talking, Jason. I would probably recommend trying to talk to a legislative champion. If you can build rapport with a legislator and then sort of have them help you navigate the process. And, if they're sponsoring it and especially if they have some weight, then there's more of a chance that it would see the light of day. Most things don't even see the light of day.
Okay.
Do you want to add anything to that, Leverett?
No, I mean, there is, I mean, we can file bills now, sort of late file bills, but they are compromised because all it takes is for one member of either branch to object to that bill, and that, that bill is compromised severely. So Joelle addressed it in the class last week. So there is a process, but it is a much harder process once the bill filing deadline has passed. We'll actually, when in 2 weeks, when our presenter of the Rosa Parks tribute Odyssey comes and speaks, she'll tell you a little bit about her adventure, for lack of a better word, with a late filed bill. And even if something is as we think as non-controversial as honoring Rosa Parks on the side of an MBTA bus. You know, all it really takes is one person to say, no, I object. And then if it's a late file bill, that bill is dead. So there's a process, but ideally, you know, you would, you know, especially if it involves money, you know, any money at all, you would, you know, hopefully it would be filed before the actual bill filing deadline. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's funny. I really appreciate that, Leverett, because I basically think it's so hard to do that I don't even think about it.
Yeah.
It's just like, well, it's passed, it's done.
Yeah, it is so hard. So we have Hewan, and then we actually have 1, 2, 3. Yep, three questions in the chat. So we'll go to Hewan, and then we'll do the questions in the chat. I think Jillian's was first. So okay, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Jason, for such a wonderful presentation. I would love to get a copy of your slides.
Oh, sure.
So my question is really basic, which is, if the budget process starts in the December for the next year, but doesn't end until towards the end of that year, how can you, I mean, I'm sure they're wrong a lot, right? So do they back into the money they have at the end? I mean,
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah, so yes, they are often wrong because it's hard to predict the future. And
they already spent money even though the bill hasn't passed, right? So
well, so they can adjust the revenue estimate. And you know, one of the important things too is after a budget becomes law, so it becomes the General Appropriations Act, right? After it's become law, you can actually file a supplemental funding bill. So for instance, with COVID, right, you know, unexpected expenses come up, the governor can file, for instance, a supplemental bill. And you actually saw one last session. It was chapter 268, I think, of the Acts of 22, was a pretty big supplemental bill. You know, it's kind of interesting to just go in there and look at what a supplemental bill is. But that is one of the processes to sort of get around, but they also do adjust the revenue estimate. Let's see. So okay. Thank you for being here, Christine. Okay, so
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry. I think Jillian's question was, what was the process in getting fair share passed?
what a process.
That took, my gosh, that took like a decade.
It was like years, right? Yeah.
It took like, yeah, I think it was like a decade because, well, so yeah, you've got to go through 2 legislative cycles, and then where the legislature sort of approves of the question, and then the SJC, the Supreme Judicial Court, struck down the initial version, and then they had to do it again. And the version that actually went to the ballot was sort of the second try after the SJC struck it down. So yeah, it was a very long fight. And it was actually interesting, you know, hearing from people who had been involved in that fight for, you know, since the beginning. It's just interesting to hear the relief in their voices of like, I've been working on this for almost a decade. Like, it's, you know, it passed. It's, you know, like a great weight was lifted off of their shoulders.
Yeah, because I mean, folks at MassBudget has been talking about fair share since I started as the ED, 8 years ago almost. And so, I mean, that's how I'm thinking it was a decade, because I remember presenters were talking about, oh, if we could get this, back it was called the millionaire's tax, that was the first time I had heard about it. And so that was being talked about when I first took this over. So, and it had been in process for a while. So, but
right.
Just to add on to my question too, Jason, do you believe that things like COVID and seeing, the budget, seeing how normal people that, maybe don't pay much attention to the budget and what funding does in Massachusetts, do you think events like COVID influenced more people to become more aware of budgeting and the impact that funding has, like how it passed now based on events of the past few years, like more people are aware of these issues?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I don't know, but I think it's certainly a plausible hypothesis. I think that I think the pandemic. This is me, Jason, talking. I think that the pandemic did highlight a lot of the unmet needs that were there, and there are a lot of people who are sitting there thinking, like, yeah, we know this, we look at this every day. But I think that there's a substantial portion of the public that doesn't think about that, and COVID might have peeled back the wool over their eyes and made them see it.
I'm one of those people. I got interested during seeing all that funding. So thank you.
And I love that. I mean, I actually had, I did a presentation not that long ago where a person came up to me after and they said, I just got involved under COVID. I was just elected to the school board and I'm on the finance committee. And like, so I think that there's probably more civic engagement than prior to COVID on some of these issues.
Right.
Okay.
I think Jinyi had a question. Do you know where the arts and cultural budget is in the budget browser? I think that's more of a technical, where is it question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I just inherited the budget browser. So I don't know that we have that as a distinct category, which I think is unfortunate. So if you go into, there's a search bar and you search arts, then a number of different programs do come up. But that's something I'll look into after the call and I'll get back to you.
Okay. Then Kiki had a question. How far in advance are the budgets proposed approved? Also, do budgets allow for new bills to come up and be funded within the fiscal year, or do these bills need to wait for a later budget to be passed?
Yeah, so right now the governor does have a little bit extra time because they're a new governor. And they're kind of in this mad dash at the beginning of the year, typically to try to come up with a budget. A budget proposal. They get input from all the secretariats in the executive branch on what they think they will need in funding for the next year. And they kind of put that together in the governor's office and in A&F. The question about new bills, I guess I would just refer back to the supplemental bills, the supplemental budgets, because that's a key way that we adjust once the GAA has been passed, the General Appropriations Act.
Okay. And David has a question. The rainy day fund. That's right. So can you talk about the rainy day fund and how that fits into the operational budget? Is there money that has to be set aside, or and I guess there's no real rhyme or reason sometimes as to how rainy day funds are released, but is there a mandatory amount that has to go into the rainy day fund in every budget cycle? And any other questions that you may have around that, David?
Actually, I was going to say, I think the rainy day fund is really what's accumulated when the revenue exceeds the expenses. But in the beginning of the budget, especially with the previous governor, there's a tendency to underestimate the revenue to drive the expenses down. So we get this accumulation of a rainy day fund that sits there that actually, one, is a surplus that can be spent, but secondly, it undercuts the idea that we're too high in taxes and so forth. But anyways, go ahead, Jason. I mean, I also want to hear.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Because they also speak to how and when the legislature or the governor decides to go after the rainy day fund to meet perhaps a supplemental budget or a bill and so forth.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because there's that point that you made about underestimating the revenue and that affecting spending, I think is a real important point that I don't think a lot of people are necessarily focused on. But I think that's something that, you know, if you care about there being enough revenue to meet the needs of folks as we see them out on the ground, then I think that's a really important point. And because, you know, you're starting the year saying, this is how much money we could build a budget off of. If you're consistently underestimating how much money you can build a budget off of, you're building a smaller budget than you could. And as David pointed out, money does get diverted into the rainy day fund. Some of that is capital gains funding, because capital gains tends to be a pretty volatile source of revenue. One of the things that's problematic about the rainy day fund is there's a, I forget what statute, I could get it, you know, the actual chapter number for you. But I think it's over, if it's 15% of the total budget, then it gets kicked over to a tax refund fund. So rather than spending it on, you know, school lunches or whatever, if you just let it sit there and accumulate, then a portion of it eventually goes into this tax refund and then goes back to folks. And, you know, I think it's good to point these things out because you have to think again about the overall picture of, are we meeting the needs of people in the Commonwealth? And if your answer to that is no, then you want to look at how much revenue we're bringing in and how much we're spending. And if you feel like we should be spending more to meet unmet needs that you see, then these processes are kind of important to lobby around, right? How are we estimating revenue? Why doesn't it start, for instance, you know, there's a world in which it starts more along the lines of what do we need versus how much do we think we're going to raise? And so you can advocate for changes in that. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but you can advocate for it. Did that kind of get at what you wanted to talk about, David? Okay.
I think the next question in the chat was from Ashley, and this is a pretty wide-ranging, broad question: is how are budget priorities established? You know, how are budgets adjusted and funds reallocated when priorities shift? But I mean, it's an excellent question, but it's that could take a bit. But yeah, it is an excellent question.
I think it's a really great question. I think one of our points at MassBudget would probably be try to have some of the priorities informed by the public. So again, making the process more transparent, bringing the public in. Participatory budgeting is one of the ways that folks have done that at the municipal level, but certainly more robust community input processes could be another way to do it. You know, right now it's a very, I think that I can say it's a process that is governed by a very small number of people who are important politically, right? So folks like in the House Ways and Means and Senate Ways and Means committees, right? They're setting priorities, and priorities can be informed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate President, right? And the governor's office. And so, you know, yes, these are elected officials, but we know that elected officials don't always have a good finger on the pulse of what is necessary. And so I think closing that loop more with community input would be important.
Great. Let's see. Jessica, is that a new hand up or is that your old hand that's still up?
No, that's new hand.
Okay, go for it. And then after you is Kelly. Kelly had a question.
If Kelly wants to go, that's fine.
Okay. Oh,
No, go ahead.
Kelly's is in the chat. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
about
mine's
that.
in the chat. Go ahead, Jessica. You go.
Thank you for answering the questions earlier. So I'm just wondering, as an advocate of early education again, so obviously there was a huge impact on the budget for 2020, 2021. So how is that trickling down to 2023, 2024? Because I don't think we're talking about the long-term impact of the budget, because there was like a complete stop, correct, with the budget when that happened, like right with the rollout.
Sorry, is this
for 2020? for 2020 and 2021
Oh,
for
2020.
state budget.
Yeah, I don't really know a good answer to that question. I could point you to Adam Jones, who is actually our like early childcare.
Is it Colin?
No, Adam actually. So we were both hired around the same time. So Adam is doing early ed, and Colin's still doing K through 12 and higher ed.
Oh, that'd be great. Connect me.
Yeah,
So
I would love
I'm just
to.
wondering, since you're the stats looking at data, how are you guys, because inflation is not enough to represent millions and billions of dollars that were impacted from 2 years earlier. And I'm on a lot of committees that, we're looking for, committee members to review budgets and things of that sort. So I just don't understand how at a state level, we're not thinking about the impact that we've already had and how that's going to continue. And then my follow-up question is that I have looked into this in regards to state budgeting for early education, and obviously the department does have its own state budgeting, but has not been increased. There's been little to no support in regards to that, and only when there's impact to the economy and the other workforces was there actually support in regards to education. So I'm just wondering, how is there state line items? Because in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about values and mission.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of where I get in the weeds of like, how is this not a mission to support families and children? And how is this not like, how many consensus do I have to get from legislators that this is an important part that affects other departments and other services and teachers and doctors, and that there is a huge impact, and like not always just saying it's expensive, because saying expensive is just deterring and undermining the work that the workforce is doing, rather than actually thinking of strength-based approach of, we know that we already spent, and I just looked it up, that in 2023 we got approved for like $1 million for education, which, what is that even going to? Does that go to the department? Because that's not going to the sector in which you guys are saying is expensive, because if it was, then there would be, some supplement or subsidy in regards to the workforce development. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment.
It's okay for it to be both. I mean, this is also a space for catharsis, as they say, right? This is difficult work, right? And I think it's all very political. And I think that's one of the points that we try to make in these presentations is, where there's values, there's politics, right? And when you're
so where does law come in, and when does it like? Because I just feel like if it's based off of people's principles of people that aren't being transparent, how are we supposed to know what their values and the principles are that are dictating people of color and people that aren't in those spaces, aren't welcomed in those spaces, and don't have the literacy or competency to even know what a bill is, or to be able to read these things? Like you were just saying, there's absolutely no transparency in regards to state budgeting. Like you said, you have to have a degree in regards to accounting or mathematics to really understand the breakdown. And even then, we're really not even seeing that information. So I'm just wondering, what is your like nonprofit coming in regards to supporting? Because I know you guys do a lot of data analysis in regards to state departments.
Yeah, sure. So actually, I want to go back to a point that I was going to make about something you said earlier, which is that yes, inflation is really important. If your funding doesn't keep up with inflation, it's a de facto cut, right? And that's something that we really want to pay attention to moving forward, because inflation was so bad, right? And is still rough. So I just wanted to put a pin in that for later.
Inflation is always going to be something that's going to come like from historical, like, we're always going to have these economic setbacks in regards to whatever the situation is. So I'm just thinking, how is this sustainable, especially in Massachusetts, where we are such a supportive education, where we're still not even supporting early education and education the highest level of quality, knowing that there's always going to be inflation or something happening. Also, there's like, my thing also is like, how do we safe proof certain, because the police are safe proof. They get money if they make mistakes, they're taken care of, but we're not safe proofing, hospitals. And like, I was just watching the news, I just closed a hospital. Like, how are we? And it's not just about childcare. I think it's more of like, how as individuals are advocating, like you're part of the data, so you're not advocating in the same way we are. Like, how can we translate the data that you're giving to us?
Yeah, so that's another great question. I was going to say off of that one of the things that MassBudget does is these presentations and workshops. And, we are a small staff, so I mean, we do run up against constraints, but like, we come and talk for free and we provide materials. So if that's of interest to anyone here, and I did see that Kelly, wrote that as a question, feel free to reach out. I'm actually sort of, again, I'm pretty recent at MassBudget. My supervisor retired. I'm kind of inheriting the budget browser. I'm inheriting budget public education. I'm inheriting fiscal analysis. So I'm definitely a person you can email or call. I mean, my cell phone number, I give it out in my email. It's, feel free to reach out and connect and see if there's something that we can do. And maybe it's me, maybe it's Adam. We might be able to do a train the trainer kind of thing. But I think that is one of our values, is trying to make this process, trying to make information more accessible. And if there's a way that we can do that, then we'd like to find a way to do it.
And Jessica, I think you expressed the frustration that I think a lot of people have, and some express it, some don't. I mean, it is an all-encompassing. Everything is interconnected. It's knowing the legislative process, knowing the budget process. The lessons we get next week on lobbying and advocacy. Charles Glick and Kate Worrell, who are presenting next week, tell stories about how sometimes they get angry because a legislator kind of sort of brushes off a constituent by who doesn't know the process. And I think when we do our case study in utilizing the press media, once the sort of the punchline is revealed, and once you see sort of who was the catalyst in the case study, I can guarantee you that you will get upset. But so this is sort of, it's all encompassing. It's kind of knowing the process, building a groundswell of support, and then even our final presenter with the Rosa Parks Odyssey, you'll see how she created this groundswell of support, and how she actually at the very end had to really tick off some people in order to get things. There's this classic photo of her chasing down Governor Baker at the elevator, which is one of the funniest photos that I see. She passes it off like, oh, there's Governor Baker. But the story behind it is, it's almost like there was a movie out, a director, Michael Moore, whose style was to chase people down with cameras. That was essentially what she did. She was like chasing down the governor as he tried to escape right before New Year's on the elevator. And so it's everything is intertwined. And so hopefully everything that we offer, it's not, if we wanted to do a 16-week, almost like a college course, we probably could. But y'all would get sick of me, first of all. And that would be, it would also be pretty, it would be pretty taxing on all of you, and it would probably be kind of expensive, just considering what we'd have to put into it. But so it's everything that we're trying to bring to the table now. It's like legislative, budget, lobbying, press and media, local government. Hannah just joined us. The importance of local government, working with agencies, they're all built together. And so, I mean, it's just, next week I think will be a very good session, because you'll learn a little bit more about, and actually the week after you'll learn more about how to lobby, how to advocate, how to build consensus, how building critical mass is important to getting the attention of legislators, how utilizing the press and media is important in getting the attention of legislators. It's all of that. And yeah, I mean, the transparency drives us crazy sometimes, but hopefully we can lay the groundwork for some of that, at least some of that, so that folks don't feel so intimidated and so overwhelmed. And so sometimes I feel helpless, and I've been in the business for 20 something years, and so sometimes it's just a very helpless feeling, but you just keep plugging away, and hopefully we're giving some tools so that you're not feeling completely helpless and you feel like, okay, I can do this, or at least I can, reach out to people and do it. So,
So,
but,
Lever, just a quick time check, just for you.
yep. Oh yeah. Yep. 7 o'clock. I think, yeah, we're gonna end right at around 7. I think we have time for one more. I think David, did you have your hand up? Was that an old hand?
Oh, I was just gonna share. We're out of time, but I think Jason hit it. It's not a technocratic or democratic necessarily. We need to look at the budget and the legislative process as a moral and a political fight. And if you understand that, and you realize people come in with different beginnings and understandings, and that the legislative, the House, it's the entire state house is a battleground of these competing interests. And if you understand that, then you can navigate how you're going to build up the support for what you're going after. And I guess I want to share with Jessica, I worked on this stuff in the 80s and 90s when it was considered childcare. It took us 8 years with a legislative champion to turn childcare into early ed. And the reason for doing that is that childcare was seen as a personal choice, whereas early ed was seen as universal. And so we fought for 8 years to make it into early ed, thinking that that would increase the budget and allocation for childcare. Because childcare was seen as the private realm, whereas education was public. So that's to say, that was the 8-year fight to do that.
Yeah.
Thank
it's
you
just
for sharing that.
Yeah, just like the fair share. I mean, it was a 10-year whatever fight, and for folks who were in Chinatown getting transliterated ballots, how many years was that fight, David? I mean, just years and years, and kind of like Joelle said, it's a slow process, and too often it's a slow process, and that's why we all have to be in it for the long term, and sometimes and it's easy to burn out. It really is. So that's why when we get into, that's why it's a very uplifting when, here I go again, when I get into a space like this, it's really uplifting because these are folks, we're all like, I've known David now for how many years? Like we've all been in this space, we're in this space together, and it's very hard to find, people like us who share that, who share this interest and who share that commitment. So that's why I always, I always say, cherish this room, cherish this, cherish the folks that you're around now, because, just, as I get older, you discover it ain't that easy to find. So that's why, it's because a lot of these fights are long and arduous, and you'll hear from our next speakers, and that can be very emotional, and you can want to give up, but thanks to sort of the presence of all of us, we support each other, we uplift each other, we keep each other going. So that's why we're here. The lessons, like Joelle said last week, the lessons are one thing, but it's the network that will keep us going. So but, anyway, it is 7 o'clock. Thank you so much, Jason. If folks have any, want to reach out to Jason, I don't know if you want to share your info in the chat, or actually MassBudget is easy, and you can also go through me, and we can, I can reach Jason. Also, MassBudget is always very, very generous in terms of sharing what they, with the presentation that they shared with us today, and so we'll get that out to you, as soon as we can. So thank you, Jason.
I just want to say I'm really humbled by all of the great people in this room, and I'm so happy to have been able to talk to you all tonight. And I really hope that something from the presentation was helpful for each of you. So if that was the case, then I feel like success. And the other thing too is, if you're ever on our website, if you're ever using our tools like the budget browser, and you have suggestions to make it better, feel free to reach out. But thanks for all the work you all do.
And
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jason. Thank you for bringing your life experiences and sort of your lived experiences to your passion and to your job and to uplifting all of us. So thank you, Jason.
Sure, thanks. All right, have a great night.